The room went silent the moment the envelope touched the table. For 15 years, everyone in the family believed Caroline Whitmore was nothing more than a quiet wife living off her husband's success. Her mother-in-law treated her like an outsider. Her sisters-in-law mocked her behind closed doors. And the woman her husband openly paraded around as his future replacement never imagined the truth. Because hidden inside that envelope was a document capable of destroying reputations, ending careers, and changing the future of a multi-million-dollar empire. What nobody knew was that the woman they had humiliated for years had been quietly holding a secret powerful enough to change everything. And by the time the emergency board meeting ended, the Whitmore family would never look at her the same way again. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 3 weeks earlier, the Whitmore fashion empire was preparing for the most important jewelry launch in company history. The business had been founded by Margaret Whitmore nearly 40 years earlier. What started as a small luxury boutique had grown into a nationwide brand worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Margaret loved reminding everyone that she had built the company from nothing. What she rarely mentioned was who had helped save it. Most employees assumed her son, Ethan Whitmore, was the future of the company. He certainly acted like it. Tall, confident, and constantly seeking attention, Ethan enjoyed being seen as the heir. At every company event, he positioned himself at the center of every photograph, every interview, every celebration, every ribbon cutting. And standing quietly beside him was Caroline, his wife. For 15 years, she had supported him through every success. Yet few people knew much about her. That was exactly how Caroline preferred it. She never fought for attention, never corrected people, never competed for recognition. She simply did her work and went home. Unfortunately, people often mistake quietness for weakness. And Ethan had started making that mistake years ago. At first, the marriage had been happy. But as Ethan gained influence inside the company, something changed. Success fed his ego. Praise became an addiction. Eventually, he began treating Caroline as though she were an employee instead of a partner. Then came Vanessa, a glamorous marketing consultant who quickly became Ethan's constant companion. People noticed. Employees whispered. Executives exchanged uncomfortable looks. But nobody dared challenge the boss's son. Caroline noticed too. She simply never reacted publicly. The more silent she remained, the more Ethan assumed she had no power. One evening, preparations for the jewelry launch were underway inside the company's flagship showroom. Hundreds of guests would attend. Investors, celebrities, business journalists, industry leaders. It was supposed to be Margaret Whitmore's crowning achievement. Caroline arrived early to help oversee final arrangements. She spent hours working alongside staff members, checking displays, reviewing schedules, solving problems, helping wherever she was needed. Many employees respected her because she treated everyone kindly, from executives to janitors. Around 6 o'clock, Ethan arrived. Vanessa walked beside him. The room immediately shifted. Employees pretended not to notice. Caroline continued reviewing paperwork. Then Ethan approached her. "Good," he said. "I've been looking for you." Caroline looked up. "What is it?" Ethan casually picked up a velvet jewelry box resting on the display table. Inside was Caroline's wedding necklace, a family heirloom. The necklace Ethan had given her on their wedding day, something she treasured deeply. He handed it to Vanessa. "I think this looks better on her." The room froze. Several employees stared in disbelief. Caroline thought she had misheard him. "What did you say?" Vanessa smiled smugly. Ethan shrugged. "You never wear it. It shouldn't go to waste." For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even Margaret Whitmore stood nearby watching. She said nothing. Caroline felt every eye in the room on her. The humiliation was deliberate, public, cruel. Yet instead of arguing, Caroline slowly closed the jewelry box. Then she placed it back on the table. "You can keep it," she said softly. Ethan smirked. He expected tears, anger, a scene. Instead, she simply walked away. That response unsettled him more than any argument could have. Because for the first time, he realized she wasn't fighting for something she considered important. As Caroline reached the exit, she received a phone call. The screen displayed a name: Daniel Mercer, the family's longtime corporate attorney. Caroline stepped outside and answered. "Hello." His voice sounded unusually serious. "Caroline, we need to meet." Immediately, her expression changed. "What happened?" There was a long pause. Then Daniel spoke carefully. "The holding company documents have been reviewed." Caroline stopped walking. The noise of the city seemed to disappear around her. "And?" she asked. Daniel lowered his voice. "There are people asking questions. Dangerous questions." Caroline's heart sank. She had hoped this day would never come. "What do they know?" she asked. "Not enough. Yet." Daniel paused again. "But that won't last." Caroline stared across the city skyline. 15 years. 15 years of silence. 15 years of protecting secrets. Perhaps that time was finally ending. What she didn't know was that events had already begun moving far faster than anyone expected. And within days, a discovery inside the company's financial records would trigger an emergency board meeting that would place the entire Whitmore empire at risk. And when that meeting happened, the envelope on the table would become the most feared object in the room. The next morning, Caroline sat across from Daniel Mercer in his downtown office. The longtime attorney looked exhausted. Several folders were spread across the conference table. For years, Daniel had protected the legal interests of the Whitmore family. But today, he looked less like a lawyer and more like a man standing in front of a storm. Caroline immediately knew the situation was worse than he had said on the phone. "What happened?" she asked. Daniel slid a document toward her. "Audit investigators found irregular transfers." Caroline studied the report. The transfers were legitimate. The problem wasn't the money. The problem was where the money had led. Someone inside the company had started tracing ownership records, following old corporate filings, following forgotten acquisitions, following paperwork that had remained buried for more than a decade. And eventually, those investigators had reached the one place nobody was supposed to find: the holding company. Caroline slowly looked up. "How close are they?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "Too close." A heavy silence filled the room. For 15 years, the structure had remained hidden. Not because it was illegal, not because it was fraudulent, but because Margaret Whitmore had insisted it remain private. Back then, the company had nearly collapsed during a devastating financial crisis. Banks were pulling funding. Investors were leaving. Competitors were circling like vultures. The entire empire had been weeks away from bankruptcy. Only a handful of people knew what truly happened during that period. And most of those people had retired years ago. Now someone was digging through the past. And once they uncovered the truth, the consequences would be impossible to control. Daniel folded his hands. "The board doesn't know yet. But they will." Caroline nodded. She had spent years preparing for this possibility. She simply hoped it would never happen. "What do you recommend?" she asked. Daniel took a deep breath. "Be ready." "For what?" "For war." Meanwhile, inside Whitmore Fashion headquarters, Ethan Whitmore was having the best week of his life. At least, that's what he believed. The jewelry launch had generated major media attention. Industry publications were covering the event. Influencers were promoting the collection. Investors seemed pleased. Everywhere Ethan went, people congratulated him. He accepted the praise as if he had built the company himself. That afternoon, he entered his mother's office. Margaret Whitmore was reviewing financial reports. For the first time in weeks, she appeared concerned. Ethan noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" Margaret removed her glasses. "There may be a problem." Ethan laughed. "There are always problems." "No," Margaret said. "This one is different." She handed him a report. He skimmed the pages, then frowned. "I don't understand." "Exactly." Margaret leaned back. "Neither do I." The report showed requests for historical corporate records, old acquisitions, archived shareholder agreements, holding company documents, records nobody had touched for years. Ethan shrugged. So what? Margaret stared at him. Because unlike her son, she understood what those records contained. And she knew what would happen if the wrong people saw them. For the first time in years, fear crossed her face. 3 days later, the first shock arrived. The company's chief financial officer abruptly resigned. No warning, no explanation, no farewell speech, just a brief letter. Within hours, rumors spread throughout headquarters. Employees whispered in hallways. Managers held emergency meetings. Executives began making nervous phone calls. Something was happening. Nobody knew exactly what, but everyone could feel it. Then the second shock arrived. A major investor requested an emergency review of company governance records. That had never happened before. By evening, several board members were demanding answers. Margaret's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Neither would Daniel's. And by midnight, the board chairman made a decision. An emergency board meeting would be held the following week. Mandatory attendance. Every director, every senior executive, every major stakeholder. No exceptions. When Ethan learned about the meeting, he wasn't worried. In fact, he was excited. He viewed it as another opportunity to demonstrate leadership, another chance to position himself as the future CEO. He even called Vanessa that evening. This could actually work in my favor. Vanessa smiled. Of course it will. Your mother trusts you. Ethan grinned. And once this nonsense is over, everyone will see I'm the only person capable of running this company. Across town, Caroline sat alone in her study. A single envelope rested on the desk in front of her. The same envelope Daniel had personally delivered that afternoon. Inside were documents few people on Earth had ever seen. Documents capable of ending careers. Documents capable of rewriting the history of the Whitmore empire. For a long moment, Caroline simply stared at them. She wasn't thinking about revenge. She wasn't thinking about humiliation. She wasn't thinking about Ethan. She was thinking about responsibility. Because she knew exactly what would happen once those papers became public. Lives would change. Relationships would shatter. And the Whitmore family would never be the same. Her phone buzzed. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. She answered immediately. Everything is ready, he said. Caroline looked at the envelope. When? Next Thursday. The emergency board meeting. The moment she had spent 15 years trying to avoid. And now it was unavoidable. Daniel's voice became serious. After next Thursday, there will be no putting this back in the shadows. Caroline nodded. I know. After ending the call, she carefully placed the documents back inside the envelope. Then she locked it inside a secure case. For a few seconds, she stood silently, looking out the window, watching the city lights, remembering every sacrifice, every insult, every moment she chose silence over conflict. Soon the truth would finally speak for itself. And when it did, nobody, not Ethan, not Vanessa, not even Margaret Whitmore, would be prepared for what they were about to learn. Because the emergency board meeting wasn't going to reveal a financial scandal. It was going to reveal something far more shocking. The true foundation upon which the entire Whitmore empire had been built. And when Caroline finally walked into that boardroom, carrying the envelope, the balance of power inside the family would change forever. Thursday morning arrived under dark, gray skies. By 9 o'clock, Whitmore Fashion headquarters was already buzzing with tension. Executives moved through hallways speaking in hushed voices. Assistants rushed between offices carrying documents. Board members arrived earlier than usual. Everyone knew something significant was about to happen. Nobody knew exactly what. Inside the executive boardroom, Margaret Whitmore sat at the head of the table. For the first time in years, she looked uneasy. Ethan sat beside her, confident as ever. Vanessa had not been invited. That alone irritated him. One by one, directors and investors filled the room. The atmosphere felt heavy. Then the doors opened. Caroline entered. In her hands was a simple black case. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic. Yet several people immediately noticed it. Daniel Mercer followed behind her. The room fell silent. Caroline calmly took her seat. She said nothing. Daniel placed a folder in front of each board member. The chairman cleared his throat. Let's begin. The first 30 minutes focused on company finances, revenue, growth projections, investor concerns, operational updates. Then the chairman turned toward Daniel. Counselor, you requested this emergency meeting. Daniel stood. I did. The room became still. He opened a folder. What I'm about to present concerns the ownership structure of Whitmore Fashion Holdings. Ethan sighed. Already bored. Margaret's hands tightened beneath the table. Daniel continued. Several recent investigations uncovered historical corporate records that required legal review. A screen illuminated behind him. Corporate charts appeared. Ownership structures. Subsidiaries. Holding companies. Investment entities. The board watched carefully. At first, everything appeared normal. Then Daniel displayed another document. Several directors leaned forward. One investor removed his glasses. Another checked the document twice. Ethan frowned. What am I looking at? Nobody answered. Daniel clicked to the next slide. The room became noticeably quieter. Then another slide. And another. Until finally the ownership chain reached its final destination. A single name appeared. The boardroom froze. Caroline Whitmore. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Ethan stared at the screen. Then laughed. That's impossible. No one joined him. He looked around. Nobody was smiling. The laughter died immediately. Daniel calmly continued. 15 years ago, during the company's financial crisis, emergency restructuring became necessary. The screen changed again. Historical records appeared. Signed agreements. Investment transfers. Corporate filings. Legal certifications. Every document authenticated. Every signature verified. Every record legally binding. Daniel looked directly at the board. The restructuring saved Whitmore Fashion from insolvency. A director swallowed hard. Are you saying? Daniel nodded. The controlling ownership interest was transferred during that restructuring. The room fell silent again. Then he spoke the sentence that changed everything. The majority controlling owner of Whitmore Fashion Holdings has been Caroline Whitmore for the last 15 years. Shock spread across the room. Several board members visibly reacted. Investors exchanged stunned looks. One executive actually leaned back in disbelief. Ethan looked as though the floor had disappeared beneath him. No. His voice was barely audible. No. He turned toward his mother. Tell them. Margaret remained silent. That silence told him everything. For the first time in his life, Ethan realized he had never truly understood the company he believed he controlled. He looked at Caroline, the same woman he had humiliated, ignored, dismissed, taken for granted, the woman he believed needed him, the woman he believed had no power. And suddenly he understood. She had never depended on him. He had depended on her. The realization hit harder than any public humiliation ever could. The chairman turned toward Margaret. Is this accurate? Margaret slowly nodded. Yes. The room erupted with questions. Why had it been hidden? Who knew? Why wasn't the board informed? How had this happened? The chairman repeatedly called for order. Eventually Margaret stood. For the first time all morning, her voice carried emotion. 15 years ago, we were finished. The room quieted. There were days when I believed this company would disappear. She paused. Every bank turned us away. Every investor walked. Nobody wanted the risk. She looked toward Caroline. But one person believed we could survive. The room followed her gaze. Margaret's eyes began to glisten. Caroline. Ethan stared at his mother, completely stunned. Margaret continued. She risked everything. She provided the resources that saved the company. Without her, there would be no Whitmore Fashion. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The truth finally stood exposed. Not as a scandal, not as a deception, but as a sacrifice. Then something unexpected happened. Margaret walked away from her seat. Slowly, deliberately, she stopped beside Caroline. For years she had treated her daughter-in-law as though she didn't belong. Now she stood before her with tears in her eyes. And in front of the entire board, Margaret said words nobody expected. "I'm sorry." The room fell silent. "I should have thanked you years ago." Caroline looked at her quietly. No anger, no bitterness, no triumph, just calm understanding. Margaret lowered her head. "You saved my life's work, and I never gave you the respect you deserved." Several board members looked away, giving them privacy despite being in a crowded room, because everyone understood how difficult those words were. Then Ethan stood, his face pale, his confidence completely gone. For several moments he couldn't speak. When he finally did, his voice cracked. "I don't deserve forgiveness." Caroline remained silent. "I spent years believing success belonged to me." He looked down. "I never asked what you sacrificed. I never appreciated what you did." The room watched, not because Ethan was powerful, but because people rarely witness genuine regret, especially from someone who spent years avoiding responsibility. He looked at Caroline. "I was wrong." 3 simple words. Yet they carried more weight than anything he had ever said. The chairman eventually called the meeting back to order. Formal votes followed. Governance changes were approved. Transparency measures were implemented. New leadership structures were established. But those decisions were no longer the most important outcome of the day. The most important outcome was something far simpler. The truth had finally come into the light. Weeks later, Whitmore Fashion continued thriving. Investors stayed. Employees remained confident. Business moved forward. But the culture inside the company changed. People no longer measured leadership by titles, or attention, or ego. They measured it by character. And nobody embodied that lesson more than Caroline. She never demanded recognition, never sought revenge, never used her authority to humiliate those who had hurt her. Instead, she chose something stronger: grace. Because real strength isn't revealed when someone gains power. It's revealed by what they choose to do with it. One evening, long after the headlines faded, Caroline stood inside the flagship showroom. Employees laughed nearby. Customers browsed displays. The company was healthy, stable, hopeful. For a moment, she looked around and smiled. Not because she had won, but because the truth no longer needed to hide. And sometimes that's the most satisfying victory of all. Not revenge, not humiliation, not power. Just the quiet peace that comes when people finally see you for who you've been all along. The room had gone silent when the envelope touched the table. But what truly changed the Whitmore empire wasn't the document inside it. It was the character of the woman who carried it. And that was the lesson nobody would ever forget. Every empire has a story, and every story reveals a character. This has been Empire Stories. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.